Welcome to today's event, a Lunch and Learn webinar, ReFED and Harvard Law School's Food Law and Policy Clinic's Food Waste Policy Finder update and the latest on state policy. Today, we'll be talking with leaders in the state level policy space about what they're doing in their state to support food waste reduction and what they think it will take to keep up the momentum. Before I introduce our moderator and transition to the panel discussion, I'm going to do a quick tool demo of our updated policy finder. In 2017, ReFED and the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic created the Interactive Food Policy Finder to provide an overview of state and federal policies that affect food waste prevention, recovery, and recycling. We chose 5 categories of law that have the potential to either significantly reduce or increase the amount of food going to landfill. This year, we updated the policy finder to streamline the user experience and make the policy information more readily accessible to a wide variety of stakeholders. To facilitate comparison between states, we added a rubric grading system of strong, moderate, and weak, where strong is our golden standard for each policy level. For date labeling and animal feed, we also rate some policies as negative if they have the potential to hinder food waste prevention or recycling. On the following slides, I'll display each policy area, its strong rubric standard, and a screenshot of the policy-specific map. Then I'll do a brief live tool demo through the website. Standardizing date labeling is an excellent way to prevent food waste. We're all familiar with date labels on a wide variety of food products, but none of these labels are federally required, and they differ vastly across states. For example, New York doesn't regulate date labeling at all, but if you cross into Connecticut, all perishable dairy products must be labeled, but neither sale nor donation is restricted. And if you cross into Massachusetts, only perishables must be labeled, but if a food is labeled and is past date, sale is practically prohibited. Consequently, many manufacturers voluntarily add labels without consistency in language. As you can imagine, this patchwork of state regulations causes confusion and leads consumers and food businesses to prematurely toss food that is perfectly good to eat. To reduce confusion and allow for an effective consumer education campaign, we recommend the 2-label system shown on the slide. We estimate that standardizing labels has the potential to prevent 582,000 tons of food waste each year. Currently, while the USDA, FDA, and California recommend this system, nothing requires manufacturers to adopt standardized labels. That said, New Jersey State Senator Bob Smith recently introduced Senate Bill 418 that would issue standardization requirements. If Senate Bill 418 passes, New Jersey would be the first state to receive a strong rating in date labeling. The policy finder highlights 2 recovery policies, the first of which is liability protections. At the federal level, the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act provides a solid foundation for protecting donors and distributors of food, but there are limitations. Protections only apply if the donor first gives the food to a nonprofit, then the nonprofit must distribute the food for free. This limits food donations as it's not economically viable to pick up small donations nor to pay a regular staff. We recommend 3 additional protections that may encourage further donations. By allowing food businesses to donate directly to those who are experiencing food insecurity, the dozen leftover bagels at your local bakery need not be wasted at the end of the day. Adding protections when a nonprofit charges a nominal fee allows for a more economically sustainable practice. And finally, because date labels usually denote expected product quality and not safety concerns, as many people incorrectly assume, specifically protecting donations of past date food broadens the availability of rescuable food. The strong rating requires that states expand protections in at least 2 additional areas, and only New Jersey has expanded protections in all 3. That said, there are several bills under consideration in both state legislatures and Congress that would expand liability protections. The Federal Food Donation Improvement Act and a bill in Pennsylvania would expand protections in 2 areas, while Virginia is considering a bill on past date protections, and Washington State is looking to expand protections in all 3 areas. Tax incentives for food donations offer a great means of profit recovery for farmers and food businesses that have edible yet unmarketable food. There are 2 federal tax incentives, but some states have chosen to offer additional credit and deduction options. In creating a tax incentive, we recommend establishing it as a tax credit rather than a deduction, as small businesses with low profit margins struggle to benefit from deductions. Furthermore, we suggest creating an incentive large enough that it might cover transportation costs to a recovery organization. As an example, California has 2 tax credits, one of which covers 50% of transportation costs of donated crops to eligible nonprofits. And finally, within recovery policies, we highlight animal feed and organic waste bans. For centuries, using food scraps as animal feed was common worldwide. The practice declined rapidly in the 1980s when several disease outbreaks were linked to unsafe animal feed. In an attempt to prevent the spread of such diseases, federal laws and regulations were enacted to restrict the practice. However, using food scraps as animal feed can be done in a safe, resource-efficient way. Under federal law, food scraps can generally be fed to animals so long as the food scraps with animal-derived byproducts are heat-treated by a licensed facility before being fed to swine, and any food scraps containing animal-derived byproducts cannot be fed to ruminants such as cattle, sheep, and goats. We recommend that states follow federal guidelines and not place further restrictions on animal feed to minimize the amount of food scraps sent to landfill. Unfortunately, all but 4 states and DC require additional permits or treatment procedures, or they outright ban the feeding of food scraps to animals. Because it's impossible to prevent and rescue 100% of food waste, we encourage states and localities to adopt organic waste bans. Waste bans vary widely from Vermont and California, which require both individuals and businesses to recycle all organic waste, to states like Maryland and Rhode Island, which have mandatory recycling only for businesses that produce over a certain threshold of waste and that are located less than 30 or 15 miles away from a recycling facility, respectively. The number of states and localities that now require food businesses to recycle or donate excess food is rapidly growing. In fact, all 3 of the speakers you'll hear from today come from states that recently enacted or modified their own unique organic waste bans. In addition to the updated maps, we added 2 downloadable handouts that allow for rapid comparison between state policies. In the policy matrix, you'll find an overview of the most common issues within each policy. For example, the tables show which states regulate date labeling on common food categories and which states have additional requirements for feeding food scraps to animals. The new state score sheet provides a summary of rubric ratings for each of the 5 policy categories. This could be useful for a quick comparison on how your state stacks up against others, or for food businesses looking to expand to a new state. Now that you have a general idea of how the policy finder works, I'm going to do a brief live demo on the website. As an example, let's take a waste-conscious consumer in California who wants to learn more about policies in their state. Once at the Policy Finder map, you can click through any of the policies to get the view that we saw in the screenshots. Through these maps, you can compare California to the other states in each of these policy categories, or you can click directly into California to read more about their policies. This page contains all of the policy information, and it's a pretty short page, but if you're specifically looking for one kind of policy, there's a jump screen on the side panel here. And if you want to learn more about a specific law, you can click into any of the legal resources that we've linked beneath each policy. Alternatively, maybe you're a food business owner who operates in several states. At the bottom of the map, you can download the summary sheets that we discussed before. And at the top, you can navigate to the federal policy page, where you can read about federal policies currently enacted, or scroll down and find proposed federal food waste policies that are currently making their way through Congress. Finally, maybe you're not new to this whole food waste thing and you're looking for a deeper dive. For that, I suggest checking out our About page, where you can find a variety of in-depth resources from the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, federal agencies, and many of our food waste partners. We are always looking to improve our policy finder, so if you see an opportunity for improvement, don't hesitate to reach out to info@refed.org. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to welcome our moderator for today's event, Emily Broad-Lieb from the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic. Emily is a clinical professor of law and founding director of the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, the nation's first law school clinic devoted to providing legal and policy solutions to the health, economic, and environmental challenges facing our food system. Working directly with clients and communities, she champions community-led food system change, reduction in food waste, access to healthy foods, and equity and sustainability in the food production. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much, ReFED, for convening this webinar and our amazing panelists who I'm going to introduce in a moment. And thank you, Samantha, for the great presentation on the Policy Finder. It has been great having your help on updating it. Samantha's done a ton of work. And as you can tell, this resource has now just so much more applicability and hopefully will be a lot more user-friendly. So as you heard, I direct the Food Law and Policy Clinic, which is an experiential learning program at Harvard Law School. And we work on a bunch of areas in the intersection of food and law, but our biggest portfolio by far is on looking at laws and policies on food waste and food recovery. So one thing I also wanted to share, as you heard, the Policy Finder really showcases enacted laws. So you can, it's more static. You can get to see what things are on the books as laws currently in states around the country. But we've also been tracking a lot of the pending proposals in states. And based on our research in 2021, state legislatures around the country introduced 99 unique food waste bills, and 28 of them passed last year. So there's many of these bills center on things like waste bans, as we'll hear about today, research, funding opportunities. A number of them are on school food waste and consumer awareness campaigns. So one of the things we're hoping to do more in the future as well is give more opportunity to share some of those dynamic bills as they're being considered. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by three fabulous speakers who are involved in passage or implementation of recent initiatives in their own states. So I'm going to introduce all of them now, and then we'll get to the conversation. So our first speaker is Representative Lauren Carson, who's a state representative from Rhode Island. Lauren was first elected to the Rhode Island House of Representatives in November 2014, and she represents District 75 in Newport. She was named Deputy Majority Leader in January of 2021. Representative Carson is the second Vice Chair of the House Innovation, Internet, and Technology Committee, and she also serves on the House Oversight Committee, the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, and the Small Business Committee. So she is very busy. She's been particularly active on issues related to environment, small business, tourism, and government transparency. Our second speaker today is Deputy Secretary Horacio Tablada, or HT. HT currently serves as Deputy Secretary of the Maryland Department of the Environment. Prior to this appointment in April 2015, he served as Director of the Land and Materials Administration for 11 years, and as its Deputy Director for 6. HT has been with the state's environmental program since 1985, and he's served in various management and technical capacities, including Program Manager of the Oil Pollution and Discharge Permit Programs. And prior to serving in state government, he worked in the private sector in solid waste management. And our third speaker today is Sally Rowland from the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. Sally is a professional engineer too in the Division of Materials Management of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, where she works in the Organics Reduction and Recycling Program. Sally is a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Clarkson University and a Master's and PhD in Environmental Engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And she's a licensed professional engineer in New York. Thank you all so much for being here. And I'm going to take us through some questions and conversation before we open it up to questions from the audience. So I wanted to ask each of you to first talk about, one big legislative or policy achievement that's recent in your state. And I think as Samantha sort of alluded already, all of you have been involved in some sort of policy recently that's really directing food away from the landfill and keeping it for donation or other recovery. So maybe we can have each of you tell us a little more about that policy and then dig in further. Lauren, I'd love if you could share first the recent law that you were involved in enacting in Rhode Island.
I'd love to do that. First of all, I want to say thank you to ReFED for inviting me here today. And I say welcome and hello to all the guests that we have from all over the world. Actually, if you look at the people that have introduced themselves, I successfully passed House Bill 5328 in 2021. That was last year. And it was a bill that did several things for the state of Rhode Island. It mandated that the all schools in the state of Rhode Island, public, private, and charter, would have waste audits by our state agency that manages waste, and that would be free to schools, because I wanted to get a handle on how much waste was being generated. That report would then be provided to school boards across Rhode Island with some strategies for reducing waste. The second thing that I looked at, which a lot of your folks are most concerned about, was food service and food service waste. My community, Newport, our Energy and Environment Commission did an audit of one of our schools about 4 years ago and found that in one day, there was about 43 pounds of food that was actually thrown away that could have been donated to food banks. It was self-contained, it was enclosed, it was milk, it was fruit. And that really struck me as something very important. So what this bill does is it requires that the vendors that apply for RFPs to provide the food service to our schools, they must compost that material and they must collect the material which can be donated to food banks and give it to food banks at their own expenses. Those vendors must also purchase 10% of locally grown food in the state of Rhode Island. So that was another aspect of the bill. So I think what the bill did was it went at a few different things. It begins the schools to begin looking at recycling. It begins them to look at their waste stream. It begins to provide strategies for them reducing their waste in the recycling bin. And it closes the cycle of food waste. You know, this is food that's been paid for by taxpayer dollars and it was ending up in the garbage. So now, instead of that happening, the food waste that's collected by the food service vendors is provided to food banks. So it was sort of a win-win for everybody all around. And it was a big success in Rhode Island. I'm really proud to have finally got it passed after 3 or 4 years trying.
That's amazing. And, it jumped out to us because it is so interesting and novel. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So let's hear about the others and then we'll kind of follow up with some questions. HT, I'm going to come to you next to talk a little bit about, I know there's been a bunch going on in Maryland, but I know we'll start with maybe one recent policy and then we can dig into a couple of others afterwards.
Sure. Hope you can hear me well. Thank you for inviting us to share with you our most recent food diversion law that was passed last year. And Maryland has been in a journey, as you know, and most of the states also. And so when we, last year in 2021 General Assembly, the Maryland Food Residual Diversion Law was passed and enacted. And that was a pivotal bill legislation that was passed. That is what we're following right now. This law basically requires the large generators of food waste divert the material from disposal. And you do it by waste prevention, food donations, animal feed, composting, or anaerobic digestion. And those are, choices that they can make. Now, the law passed is be phased in. As you imagine, this is a major piece of legislation. And starting in January 2023, which is still not that far away now. It's just a few months away, 9-10 months away. For generators generating 2 tons or more of food per week. And also in the following year, in 24, for generators, 1 ton per week. So it starts with 2 tons and then down to 1 ton. This applies to generators that are located within 30 miles of an organic recycling facility that is willing to accept the material. And this is kind of like an exit ramp in a way, but we thought that was a good way to start. There's many anaerobic digestion facilities, many composting facilities being built as we speak for the last, so we built the infrastructure first, and that has been in place already. So we figured that this will capture most of the central part of the state, which is the most populated, where the majority of the people live. Now, to ensure rollout of this new law to be successful, we began critical work with the generators and the potential users. We have created maps, or are creating maps, guidelines, fact sheets for businesses, institutions that do the waste generation, and then to help them comply with the law. We also working with, on the other side, with the recyclers, the organic facilities, and disseminate information to them also to help them out. So this is the basic law is, I'm sure they can be available for more details, but this is where we've been focusing for the last 9 months, and hopefully we can learn from that and build upon it. So with that, thank you again.
Thank you. And I know we'll circle back to talk about some of the other initiatives, but that's a great lead into Sally, because that's sort of a nice lead into, New York passed a similar law, slightly different, a little previously, and is now maybe a step ahead. So Sally, do you want to tell us about what New York's law does and where you are in implementation?
Sure. Thank you, Emily. Yes, New York State, as Samantha showed on the map, is one of the states that has a statewide law. It passed in 2019 in New York State, became effective January 1st of this year, 2022. So we were fortunate, even before it passed in 2019, it had been proposed for a couple of years before that, so we've had a lot of time to get ready for it. But what the law says, the basics are that if you are a large generator in New York State, generating 2 tons per week or more, similar to Maryland, that you are first obligated to donate to the maximum extent practicable. So it's one part that we're really focusing on, as well as the recycling components. And then after donation, if there's a viable facility within 25 miles, that you are obligated to recycle organics. You're not obligated in New York to use that facility. You can use any facility you want. It's just kind of a benchmark for bringing you under the recycling umbrella.
I hate to interrupt you. Your audio is a little it's coming through a little strangely over here. I can make out what you're saying, but it has like a kind of robotic sound to it.
Sorry about that. Is that better?
No, I don't think so.
Try muting and unmuting. See if that helps. Is that any better?
I think it is actually.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll give you a quick.
It's not really better. I mean, I don't know, do you have any other options there? Like, do you have any headset or anything like that?
Yep. Let me try that. Yep. Hold on just a second.
Okay. And if you need a sec, I can ask a question from someone else and come back to you. That's better. All right, we'll give Sally a moment here, see if this works.
It just wouldn't be a Zoom meeting with at least one technical difficulty. Really.
Totally.
I don't know how much you're playing.
I know.
It's
we're
okay.
all
All right.
All right, Sally, let's try it.
Is that better?
Yes. Thank you.
All
so
right.
much. It's much better. All right. Sorry to have to pause the show for a moment.
Yep. Sorry about that. Too many different varieties of technology available here. Let's see. In New York, as I mentioned, we do have a state law passed in 2019, effective January 1st of this year, 2022. Those large generators, 2 tons a week per more, are obligated to first donate to the maximum extent practicable in New York State. And then after that, to recycle the food scraps if there's a viable facility within 25 miles. They're not obligated to use that facility. They can go anywhere they want. It's just how do they get ready? Where does it, put them in the system where they have to recycle or not? We have had a couple of years to get ready for it, actually a little bit more than that. So we have a number of things going on in New York to help implement, which we can talk about in more detail. One of the big things we're very proud of is the ability and our motivation for donation. We've already seen a lot more donation because of the law even before it became effective. So there's a lot going on there. We're hoping to see, as part of our, we have a New York State Climate Act, and one of the recommendations of the Waste Panel and our Climate Act is to lower that number, so to include more generators. So we're hoping to see an amendment to that law, New York State law, in the near future to bring even more generators into the system. So to us, it's a starting point, a big important one, but just a starting point at this time.
Great, thank you so much. So nice to be able to hear you clearly. So I'm going to start off with, I'm going to ask a couple questions. We have about, a little more than 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to our audience questions. So HT, I know I've alluded a few times to how the waste residuals law that you mentioned has just been part of a bunch of efforts underway in Maryland. Do you want to take us through a couple of those other exciting initiatives and policies and let us know kind of how this fits into that mix?
Yeah, this started basically in 2016. At the end of the previous administration, there was a ban on landfills, new landfills. And so people were really, industry got kind of woken up because say, oh my God, no new landfills, what are we going to do with it? So, and the purpose was to, incentivize recycling and minimization and things like that. When current Governor Hogan came in office, he did an executive order that created what is the basis of a lot of the momentum that is happening in Maryland related to sustainable materials. It shifted the focus from instead of just a ban on one specific facility to broaden to managing food sustainability through life cycle, and not just composting, but preventing and recovering edible food for donations. So that was donation. That was part of the impetus of everything that has been happening since then. And then we did there was a study that was done that was very important, and that was a waste source study. And I think somebody mentioned already some of those studies before, where we found out that almost 20% of the Maryland waste that goes to landfill is food. And we thought, okay, we deal with food, then we didn't help with climate change. We help with landfill capacity, and we provide nutrient. We record some of the nutrients. So with that, not just composting is important, but also the food donations and things like that. So there was some other large stakeholder group, and one key point here is that you can never do this alone. It cannot be just the government by itself. So you need collaboration with other stakeholders. So we always have worked together with industry, on both sides, not just the collecting side, but the generators. So academia, anybody at the table, so we can all come up with good solutions for us. And part of that, several key policies have come up, including legislation 2019 that created tax credit for farms that donate surplus food. So that was very innovative, and also other issues related to schools. And so all this one has been pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, to address waste minimization.
Thank you. And I know on the tax piece, one part that was innovative in Maryland that I haven't seen in any other state was starting with a pilot in a few counties, and then after it was successful, expanding statewide. And so I know, I get to look at all the time this data on how the different states compare, but that was a really innovative thing that I think Maryland did really well. So that's pretty cool. Lauren, kind of coming to you, you mentioned that, so the bill had been introduced before, it's something you've had an interest in. Tell me a little bit about what you think got it across the finish line this time around. What were some of the, other interests you had to bring together, or tips on doing something like this and getting the political will in another state?
Well, there was one technical aspect that brought the bill over the finish line, and that is in the state of Rhode Island, we're required to have the bill introduced in both chambers. And I didn't have a Senate sponsor the first 2 years. So once I found a Senate sponsor, both chambers have to pass identical bills. So once I had the Senate sponsor, then I had a lot more traction to pass the bill. I also think that the bill just generally made sense to different people for different reasons. It made sense to the agricultural community because they could see that I wanted products to be purchased in the state. It made sense to the people interested in the food banks. They were interested in capturing the food that was not going to be thrown away anymore. It made sense to like good government people because, as I said earlier, my argument always was that taxpayers were buying the food, then they were paying to have it driven to a landfill, and then and it was a complete cycle of wasted money and the resource was going right into the garbage can. And I think that argument really made sense to a lot of people on the committee. They were like, yeah, we should be recapturing this stuff. We should be making good sense of this. So I think it was a variety of things that really brought the bill together. And it was there's really not much that the schools themselves had to do. I made it really easy for them. The waste audits, which they have to do every 3 years, are free. And Rhode Island Resource Recovery Corporation will come in, as they do in the normal course of their work, and do a waste audit and give them a report. So as we all know, if you start really looking at what you're putting in the waste can, you can actually start saving money. And so I think that a lot of people understand that. Another aspect of it was I was told by our educational programs in the schools on waste that it really makes sense to start with the children because the children bring the good habits home. And so by creating these programs in the schools, hopefully some of these good habits for recycling, managing waste, and composting are working their way into their family lifestyles and their family homes. So I think it all came together. I think it made sense to people.
I was going to actually ask on that. You kind of hit on this, but just choosing to work with schools, there's sort of a lot of like pros and cons. I'm curious, it sounds like in the end it came together, but advice for someone from another state that might be thinking about whether or not to focus on schools, or I know in some states, schools are really exempt even from the waste bans that they do have. I don't know if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, well, again, the whole bill was a reaction to the waste audit that was conducted in the Newport Grammar School was done by volunteers of our city commission. And they just went in and they watched how much food was thrown away, and then they generated this report for the municipality saying, look at all this, 43 pounds a day in one school. Rhode Island it's obviously a very small state, but we have well over 100 schools. You multiply that out times, however many days kids go to school, and we're talking about a tremendous amount of waste. So I think the numbers started to make sense to people. And after that was done in the school, I had some data. I would bring the folks in and say, look, they did the waste audit. This is what they found was being thrown away. People were like, oh, okay. We shined a spotlight on the issue, I think.
That's great. Yeah, totally. Bringing the data in, people can't say, well, we don't know what's happening. You have really good evidence. That's great. Sally, I want to pull you into the conversation. I'll ask a question with two parts to it, and you can pick which one to focus on, but I'm curious about challenges you expect with kind of enforcement of the New York law, and maybe on the flip side of it, what role you think New York can or plans to play on really helping make connections between food waste generators and food rescue organizations to help the donation of edible food.
Sure. I think one of the issues we are facing is just having the generators know even about the law. We've done a lot of outreach, a lot of webinars, direct emailing, letters to generators, but we still find that generators aren't even aware the law exists in New York State. So a lot of it is education. We have done a lot on the donation side. We formed a task group in New York to help advise us on donation issues early on, to say what what should we do to implement this? Because an environmental agency, we haven't dealt a lot with donation in the past. And they've been very helpful in drawing that line of course, we want more donation, but we don't want our not-for-profits to be dumping grounds either for material that's not appropriate. So we've tried to walk that line with the generators to find out what they can do. We've done that through a number of means. One is funding. We provided grants starting a couple of years ago for both on the large scale. We have 10 food banks, large food banks in New York State. We provided funding for them to gear up for the law so they could buy equipment and have new staffing and things like that. We also provided funding to the smaller entities. We have 84 grants for small soup kitchens and what have you for the same thing to kind of gear up, get ready for the law. In this last year, we have a new grant with Feeding New York State, which is the Association of New York State Food Banks, where they run a call center and do direct assistance to the generators on how to increase food donation. And it's interesting, the first 3 months of operation, they've already found more than 100,000 new pounds of food to be donated, including from existing grocery stores and existing donators. So these are not necessarily new ones, some are, but even the existing ones to go find materials they didn't know could be donated or didn't know how to donate. So we're really excited about that aspect. They expect to have more than 1 million new pounds donated this year in 2022. So we think that's a huge effort. Of course, we want to see more capacity on the recycling side. So we provide grants through our department to municipalities to expand or to put up new organics recycling facilities. We also support, we have the Pollution Prevention Institute, which is out of RIT in Rochester, New York, has a grant program with state monies for the private side. So they help private facilities to expand it. So we've been kind of trying to hit all bases from the get-go and trying to get everybody moving in the right direction.
It's amazing. And one common thread I hear from all of you is just rethinking, or maybe not rethinking, but thinking a lot about the role of, state government or government in general in really providing all of these resources and making it simpler for regulated parties to really reduce their waste. So whether it's providing free waste audits, like doing all of the listening and the work that Maryland did, New York, the funding stream, the hearing what the real blockades were. So it's amazing just to hear, how that's all played out. I'm going to ask another question, and then I'm going to start turning it to, I know there's been some questions coming through the chat, so I'll ask one more and then I'll pull up some of those. I guess this one's for any one of you or all of you if you want to answer, and it's really about what do you think has been, any tricks of the trade that you have on how you really got the momentum to, bring people together to get this enacted. And I think related to that too, any tips on really thinking about this in the context of racial equity and bringing in underserved communities or communities that typically aren't as involved in policymaking, and how you kind of think about that thread with regard to some of these kinds of policies. So you can answer all of that or one part of it, but any of you want to jump in on that? Lauren, I saw you just unmute, so if you want to jump in.
I think that the general public's attitude about waste has changed in the past 10 years. I think that, the stuff we see in the media about the stuff floating in the Pacific Ocean, the island of waste there, what we see coming up on the beaches when in coastal states, I think that, people are really realizing that waste is a huge problem. I think that there's been like a coalescing of the general public. People are really demanding less waste all around. And, that's due to all the work that we're doing and many other people that aren't on this call. So I do think there's public momentum. I'm in the process of doing a survey of my district for the past couple of weeks, and there were about 15 or 20 topics that constituents could respond to. And waste and plastic waste is coming in as almost, really dealing with it is coming in as one of the top 3. I know that my community is very concerned about that because of a lot of waste on the beaches. We're a coastal town, but I'm really surprised at how high that is coming in. Now, people, I think, are really getting the story about waste, and they want to control it. They see the contribution it's making to other things, particularly climate change, and they want to stop it.
That's great. It's good to know that the momentum from constituents is the wind at your back. HT, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would like to just touch briefly on the issue of environmental justice and on the stored communities. Obviously, that's a very high important topic for us, and in everything in this, we at the Department of the Environment, the Secretary Ben Grumbles has signed a environmental justice policy at the end of 2020, which is being implemented across the whole agency. And obviously, as you know, the siting of food recycling facilities, composting facilities, never been that's not something a lot of people want in their backyard. So that's been something that we have starting to work with local governments, because the Maryland zoning is part of the local government jurisdiction, not part of the state. So we have come up now with what we call the EJ screen map and a mapping tool that is based a lot on EPAs, but it's more focused on the area for Maryland, and that's helping us to we're not there yet, to look at permit decisions, ensuring compliance in these communities. That if you have a facility there, at least you want to be sure they're in compliance with the law, and also in investing on infrastructure. So those are areas that we're going to, as those areas are implemented in environmental justice across the state, facilities like this may be more suitable in communities because there'll be more compliance and more oversight.
Great. It's amazing to hear. And I don't know if the tool is something that you can share, but I feel like it might be useful for other states too.
Yeah, our EJ screening map is going to be available pretty soon to the public. Right now, we're using it internally, just to be sure that everybody gets used to working with it. And the University of Maryland, Dr. Jacoby Wilson has a big map also, but ours is very focused on environmental projects and not just social issues. So therefore, it took a little bit of the other ones and built a better platform, or one that I think is better. But anyway, everybody, and it's something that is usable to the permit writers, to the enforcement people. Otherwise, if it's too complicated, nobody's going to use it. So that's what we're working right now. It's just to learn the stuff to facilitate, use. If I can use it, everybody else can use it. That's the test that I always give. So anyway, so hopefully maybe in a few months I can send you guys once it's publicly available, so you can share it.
Sounds great. Sally, if I can I take you in a different direction? Because we had a few questions that I think are like maybe go towards you, and you can, if you had a response to that one, you can fold it in. But a couple of folks kind of asked about, one was a question about providing grants, and just, is there any sort of direct targeted investment in making sure that funding and grants that are available are getting into underserved communities and are making the most impact? And then relatedly, someone asked about whether New York is working with food rescue organizations as well, or only food banks. Like, is it, at the largest scale, are you also working at kind of the more local scale food rescue? So you can I know I gave you a lot of things to respond to.
That's fine. Yes, we recognize, actually early on, we had a lot of those discussions about food banks versus the smaller scale food soup kitchens and the direct service agency. So we have done it. We've had grant programs for both. We've had grant programs directly for the large food banks, but we've had grants directly for small soup kitchens, anywhere from $1,000 to buy equipment and things, up to freezers and things like that, recognizing that, yes, it's not just the larger food banks that have a role. So we've tried to do both. We also have an upcoming grant program in the state this year for municipalities with $2 million, but we're designating half of that, $1 million, for those projects that are in EJ communities. So we're trying to funnel some funding directly. Understanding it, when we went through climate talks last year, we went through that, and one of the things that was raised was it's also an opportunity. It's not just a burden potentially, but these are opportunities for those communities where it's a community garden, it's local jobs for organics recycling, organics collection. So we certainly want to promote that and support that funding wise too. So we're trying to do that on that front as well.
Great. Well, another question that's come up, and just to see if anyone has thoughts, it sounds like there's some questions about is there some sort of template available for like local level? So maybe asking that a little more broadly, is there, and I guess maybe especially for Sally and HT, are there any tools that you're providing to make it really easy for local governments to kind of implement and enforce and, you know, maybe even elaborate on what the state is doing at the state level if they want to go beyond it?
Yep, I know at least, and I'm sure in Maryland too, we have lots of guidance on our website and booklets. And we link with other agencies and other entities in New York to try to provide guidance for all the chain of events. So is it the transporter? What guides for a transporter? What role can a local government play? Even if it's a state law, like in New York, local governments can play a role. Sometimes they operate yard waste compost sites. They want to take food waste at those sites. You know, what role can they play to help that? Or how can they help the businesses in their community that are now looking to recycle or donate more? So yeah, we're certainly not the only ones. Lots of guidance out there, but we can help kind of pinpoint where the guidance for any specific topic is, if that's someone's looking for. It may be on our website, it may be another, but certainly we can help guide people to that.
That's great.
I just only want to add that in Maryland, because the strong presence of local governments, they're really the one that control the solid waste, the recycling, composting, all that. Is a lot of times the local governments are when they initiate some of these measures, and then they bring it up to the state level. Oh, it's working great over here. Let's do this over there. In the county that I live here, Howard County, which is between Washington and Baltimore, was one of the early counties that collect composting in our in the community. So they said, when anybody wants to be a part of the pilot, I raised my hand, and so they gave me a little green can to collect my composting. And I talked to the executive once and said, hey, how about give me some tax credit for me composting? And that's less money for your landfill and things like that. And he said, well, just think of it that you get a free can, and that's good. And now it's countywide, and all the counties are jumping in, and their facilities being built because in response to the citizens wanting this. So local governments play a big role on those collaborations. When we sit at the table, they're part of the discussion. And we know that not all shoe fits everybody, because in Maryland, Central Maryland is very urban. You go to regional Maryland, Western Maryland, Eastern Shore is very rural. And you cannot force a law sometimes in those areas the same way, because it's just different businesses.
Yeah, that's great. It's really interesting. And I guess in both of your states, there's like really different components in the urban and rural areas that you have to grapple with any of these. So there's another question that I think is kind of interesting about just any thoughts on requirement of more measurement of food waste by businesses, maybe by local government, state government. And I don't know, Lauren, maybe I can even start with you. I know this is part of, your legislation is at least requiring waste audits of schools, and they're regular, so you'll be getting this regular measurement. Do you think that is there any thought that could also be applied to any other entities or a requirement on business? And then if anyone else wants to jump in on that, because I know this is a challenge of just not having kind of regular high quality data on the amount of food waste and where it's happening.
Well, I have another bill that's being heard this year. I want to do a waste audit of our state house, because our state house, we don't necessarily generate food waste, although there may be some. We generate a tremendous amount of plastic and paper waste. And so I'm hoping that, that by getting Rhode Island Resource Recovery to come in and look at what we're doing, we're going to continue this conversation about reducing waste across at least governmental systems. So I'm looking forward to that. We generated like 65,000 plastic bottles last year in the state house in the state of Rhode Island, which is just completely unbelievable for a part-time legislature. So, so I'm just, again, trying to shine a light on some things. I also wanted to speak to, the result of my bill, or even about 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of resources began going into small nonprofit efforts to create composting efforts in communities. And I know that some environmental organizations were funded to work in targeted areas with businesses, like in my community. I know that there was some money that was given to nonprofits and Viros, and they started doing compost programs with the restaurants in town. And we're a large tourism community. So they targeted here so that there would be some recognition of the waste that we generate here. So that's sort of been what's happened in Rhode Island in the past 3 or 4 years, to slowly but surely get into the business community and to encourage those businesses that are ready to do it to set models for composting their waste.
That's great. I will say one thing, and then I'll see if our other panelists have a response on that question. But you've raised a couple times, and I think there's not a great answer for this. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but there is sort of this trade-off often between food waste and plastic waste, where sometimes efforts to reduce food waste can actually result in more plastic waste. And I'm curious if anyone has like any creative thing you're doing to get at that, or at least try to be thoughtful about that trade-off. And I think we saw, again, with plastic waste too, just an increase in that issue because of the pandemic and some of the safety measures put in place. Anyone have any creative take on that?
It's a tough one. Yeah, there's not a lot of easy answers.
Mhm.
But I think there's a lot of work being done on both sides. Certainly a lot of work being done on the biodegradable packaging issue that helps in the organics as well, organics recycling. The whole issue of depackaging, taking food scraps out of packages, because it's just amazing how much food, goes in pallets and pallets of, cans of soda that never get sold and stuff like that we see now showing up at organics recyclers. So there's a lot of that going on. But you're right. I think in any aspect we look at environmental stuff, there's always going to be a trade-off. And COVID certainly has shown us that there's a lot more takeout containers, a lot more different things in the waste stream we didn't see a few years ago.
Yeah, in Maryland, we had several plastic banning also. I mean, it used to be like in the grocery stores in the whole state that you cannot get a plastic bag unless you pay for it.
Right.
Which means then the money goes to help recycling of the project. So most people immediately we put a fee on it. I said, well, I'm not paying. I bring my bag, or I bring my old they're heavy duty bags that you can bring and carry your stuff. So also styrofoam, is banned except
Right.
for food container. Like when you put meat, it has to be in a styrofoam, or certain eggs because of the bacteria contamination. So for health reasons, there are exemptions, but so that has minimized also the amount of plastic that is being generated in the state.
So if it's okay, I'm gonna ask everyone a very quick, rapid, like lightning round closing question, which is just, do you see the positive momentum in your state going forward? Or, what's one thing you're excited about that you think kind of on the horizon for 2022 in your state in this topic?
I can start go ahead, Sally, I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think I'm sure for all of us, what we really see driving this even more in New York State is climate. Is that everyone understands that getting those organics out of the landfill in New York State, in the waste sector, methane leaks from landfill are the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in the waste sector. So obviously a blinking light, as was mentioned, 30% of the waste stream is organics, at least. So climate to me it's the right thing to do, and it's going to be a huge driver in this realm. It's not just about recycling because it's the right thing to do. It's about climate impacts.
Absolutely, 100% from Rhode Island. There's a tremendous emphasis on climate, and people are really connecting a lot of the causes back to climate, and this is one of them.
Yeah, the same thing in Maryland. As a matter of fact, years ago there was a big hearing in the Senate on a very large climate bill that is kind of like the climate bills with all the climate bills. And you hear people saying this should have been done 10 years ago, but here we are today doing it. It's very so it's going to pass, and somehow some version of it. And obviously methane is a big component of it.
Great. Well, I'm excited. I mean, we saw, like I said, I started out by mentioning all the energy last year. Your states are all kind of part of this leading edge in the things that you're doing. So it's been really an honor to speak with such leaders and to hear about the exciting policies. I'm gonna turn it back to ReFED because I know they have a few closing things to do, but thank you. And I want to note also, thank you for the incredibly active chat to all the audience. Like there's so much content there. I was, I feel like I need to go back through and click on a bunch of these links. So thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you to all of the speakers for sharing your time and expertise with the audience today. I also want to thank all of you out there for taking time out of your day to join us. We'll be sending out an email with a link of the recording of today's webinar, along with some highlights from our discussion. Please feel free to share it with a colleague who you think might be interested in any of the material. And if you have any remaining questions or feedback, please reach out to my colleague Lily at lily.hurd@refed.org. You'll see that email in the chat, and we'll also put it on the screen for you at the end. As I mentioned at the top of the hour, we have a couple of questions for you. Please take a moment to answer the poll popping up on your screen right now. Your input will help us as we plan out future events. Awesome, lots of results coming through. I'm gonna give it about 15 more seconds for folks to respond. Great, thank you, everybody. So if you've joined any of our other events recently or are part of our mailing list, you'll know we talk about the ReFED Food Waste Action Network a lot, and that's because we really want you to join. It's a great way to help foster collaboration across the food system to reach our collective reduction goals. So if you're not already part of the Food Waste Action Network, please sign up using the link in the chat. On March 2nd, we'll be hosting our first Innovation Demo Day of the year. You'll have the opportunity to hear from food waste solution providers who give wasted food another life by creating products from waste-derived materials. From animal feed to bioplastics, cosmetics, and chemicals, there are a wide variety of ways that wasted food is being put to use. Hear what these innovators are doing to reduce food waste and get a chance to have your questions answered in a special Q&A section. On May 10th to the 12th, we'll be presenting the 2022 Food Waste Solutions Summit in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The summit is a premier food waste event of the year, bringing together food businesses, funders, solution providers, innovators, policymakers, nonprofits, and more to drive the adoption of solutions to reach our collective goal of a 50% reduction in food waste by 2030. Tickets are going quickly, so register now. And please note that the nonprofit and government tickets have already sold out, and we've started a wait list for those sections. We're also offering a range of special field trips during the afternoon of May 10th before the official summit kickoff that evening, and some of those have already filled up as well. So act now. Take a look at the link in the chat to learn more and register. And that's it for today. We'll leave the webinar open for another minute or so you can grab any of the links from the chat. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.